first days of Trump's second term have brought a wave of executive orders, each sparking debates about their legality and their impact on America's future. From tariffs to immigration to climate policy to government accountability, these decisions are setting the tone for what could be a transformative and contentious 4 years. But the stakes go beyond headlines. These policies affect real people, real communities, and the balance of power in Washington. Welcome to Politics Explained, where we deliver unbiased, unfiltered, and understandable analyses of today's most pressing issues. I'm Jen.
And I'm Bill. Today, we're diving deep into Trump's most controversial executive actions, exploring their legal challenges, political fallout, and what they mean for the average American. What do these policies mean for our nation's priorities, our communities, and the challenges we face ahead? Let's break it down.
Let's kick off with one of the most debated issues in Trump's recent executive actions: tariffs. The administration is proposing a 25% tariff on imports from Mexico and Canada and a 10% tariff on imports from China, set to take effect on February 1st. The stated goal? Protect American industries and address trade imbalances. But here's where it gets interesting. These tariffs have sparked backlash from industries and allies alike, leading to signs that the administration might soften its stance. So, how do these tariffs stack up as a strategy? And what does the potential shift say about the administration's priorities?
That's right, Jen. Tariffs have been a cornerstone of Trump's trade policy since his first term, but this time the stakes feel even higher. Take Mexico and Canada, two of our biggest trading partners. The administration's argument is that these tariffs will help rebalance trade deficits, encourage domestic production, and enforce fair trade practices. The real question is whether these goals outweigh the economic and political costs.
And that's where I see a major problem, Bill. Tariffs like these don't exist in a vacuum. They directly impact industries and, more importantly, consumers. For instance, the North American automotive supply chain is deeply integrated. Parts cross borders multiple times before a car rolls off the assembly line. Adding a 25% tariff to that process doesn't just disrupt supply chains, it drives up costs for businesses and consumers. And let's not forget sectors like technology and pharmaceuticals. Tariffs on key components could force companies to raise prices or even cut jobs, hitting working families the hardest.
I get where you're coming from, Jen, but tariffs aren't just about economics. They're a tool to address systemic trade imbalances. Take the trade deficit with Mexico, for example. By making imports more expensive, tariffs incentivize companies to shift production back to the U.S., potentially creating jobs in manufacturing and agriculture. And it's not just about jobs. With Canada, the administration has long criticized their protectionist dairy policies, which make it harder for American farmers to compete. Tariffs could be the leverage needed to push for fairer terms.
But Bill, isn't there a risk of alienating key allies here? Canada and Mexico aren't just trading partners. They're vital to our economic and geopolitical stability. Policies like this strain relationships at a time when cooperation is more important than ever, whether it's on trade, security, or even climate initiatives. And let's not forget retaliatory tariffs. If these countries respond in kind, it could hurt U.S. exports, especially in agriculture and manufacturing.
That's a fair point, Jen. And it's probably why we're seeing signs of softening in the administration's stance. Industries like automotive and pharmaceuticals have been vocal about the potential fallout, and that pressure is clearly being felt. But I'd argue this is part of the process. The administration is using tariffs as leverage, and adapting to feedback doesn't weaken the strategy, it makes it more effective.
I see what you're saying, Bill, but the back and forth sends mixed signals to industries trying to plan for the future. This uncertainty is bad for business. If the administration is going to impose tariffs, it needs to be clear and consistent about its goals and timelines.
I get that, but I'd argue that the flexibility we're seeing now is a sign of pragmatism, not indecision. It shows the administration is listening to stakeholders and adjusting its approach to minimize harm while still pursuing its objectives.
Even with adjustments, the impact on consumers can't be ignored. Tariffs raise the cost of imported goods, electronics, cars, medicines, and those costs are often passed directly to families. For low-income households, that's a burden they can't afford to carry.
And that's where I think the administration would argue for patience. Tariffs might cause short-term pain, but the long-term goal is to create a more balanced and resilient economy. If it means more jobs and stronger industries down the road, isn't it worth it?
Bill, I just can't get behind the idea that this is a strategy worth pursuing. Sure, tariffs might sound good in theory, but in practice, they're hurting the very people they claim to help. Families can't wait years for the long-term benefits you're talking about. They're struggling now, and these policies are making it worse. And let's not ignore the broader picture. These tariffs are alienating allies and creating unnecessary tensions. How does that make us stronger in the global economy?
Jin, I think you're oversimplifying this. Tariffs aren't meant to solve everything overnight. They're part of a bigger strategy to level the playing field. You can't keep letting countries like China, or even Canada, take advantage of us. If short-term pain is the price for long-term stability, then it's a price worth paying.
Well, I guess time will tell, Bill. Maybe these tariffs will work out the way you think, but I still can't shake the feeling that the costs outweigh the benefits. For now, we'll just have to see how it plays out. Speaking of bold and controversial moves, next we're diving into Trump's push to end birthright citizenship and what it means for constitutional law and families across the country. Stay with us. Birthright citizenship. It's been a cornerstone of America's identity since the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. But with Trump's new executive order aiming to restrict this right, we're facing a major constitutional and societal debate. This move, if upheld, could reshape the very definition of citizenship in the US. But here's the key question. Can an executive order overturn what many consider a settled constitutional guarantee?
It's definitely a bold move, Jin, and you're right. It raises major constitutional questions. But from a purely practical standpoint, the U.S. immigration system has some glaring flaws. Trump's administration is banking on this being the first step in addressing them, even if it's a legal gamble. That said, we need to ask, does this approach actually solve the problem, or just kickstart years of legal battles?
Exactly, Bill. The 14th Amendment clearly states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. Legal precedent, like the 1898 Supreme Court case United States versus Wong Kim Ark, reaffirmed this principle for children born to non-citizen parents residing in the U.S. This executive order, in many ways, directly challenges that ruling. So, the administration is effectively asking courts to reinterpret a fundamental part of the Constitution, a move that hasn't been attempted on this scale before.
But here's the thing, Jin. Many argue that the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof in the 14th Amendment could be interpreted differently. Supporters of this order say it wasn't meant to include undocumented immigrants or certain non-citizen groups. Look, I'm not saying it's an open and shut case, but this interpretation has been debated for years. The courts might actually take this up, and it's not unreasonable to think they could side with the administration.
But Bill, this isn't just about legal interpretation, it's about people. If implemented, this order could create a generation of stateless children, kids born in the U.S. with no citizenship anywhere. That's not just a legal issue, it's a humanitarian crisis waiting to happen. How can we justify leaving families and children in limbo just to send a message about immigration?
Jin, I don't think anyone is happy about those potential outcomes, but the administration would argue this is about deterrence. If people know that crossing the border illegally won't result in citizenship for their kids, they might think twice before coming here in the first place. And while it sounds harsh, you have to admit that our current system is being overwhelmed. At what point do we say enough is enough and take a hard stance?
Taking a hard stance is one thing, but this policy is completely impractical, Bill. How do you even enforce something like this? Verifying parental immigration status at birth would require a massive overhaul of our documentation systems, not to mention the legal battles that will erupt almost immediately. This feels more like a symbolic move than a realistic policy shift.
Symbolic or not, Jin, it puts the spotlight back on immigration reform, a topic that Congress has been dodging for decades. Maybe this forces a broader conversation about what citizenship means in modern America. And honestly, isn't it about time we ask those questions? The world has changed since the 14th Amendment was written. Our policies should reflect that.
Sure, we need to have that conversation, but this isn't the way to start it. Instead of addressing the root causes of immigration, We're punishing children and families who are already vulnerable. That's not reform. That's a failure of leadership.
I see your point, Jin, but I'd argue that leadership sometimes means making tough calls. If this executive order forces Congress to finally take action on immigration, then maybe it's worth the controversy.
Well, Bill, I guess we'll just have to see if that action ever comes. For now, this executive order feels like another way to kick the can down the road while families suffer. Coming up, we'll dive into Trump's broader immigration policies, including the Remain in Mexico policy and the designation of Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations. Stay with us.
Let's talk immigration, a topic that's never far from the headlines. With Trump back in office, we've already seen sweeping executive actions aimed at border security and asylum reform. From reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy to declaring a national emergency at the border, it's clear that immigration is a top priority for this administration. But here's the question. Are these measures addressing real issues, or are they creating new ones?
That's the heart of the debate, Bill. Let's start with the Remain in Mexico policy. This forces asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases are processed in U.S. courts. On paper, it's about managing the flow of migrants, but in practice, it's led to overcrowded camps and dangerous conditions for vulnerable families. To me, it seems less like a solution and more like a deterrent, one that disproportionately harms those who are already desperate.
I get where you're coming from, Jin, but let's not ignore the challenges on the U.S. side. Our immigration courts are overwhelmed, with years-long backlogs in some cases. Keeping asylum seekers in Mexico might not be perfect, but it does reduce the strain on border facilities and gives authorities more time to process claims. And let's be honest, without some kind of deterrent, the system risks being completely overrun.
But Bill, the question is whether this deterrent comes at too high a cost. Reports from these camps show alarming rates of violence, human trafficking, and inadequate access to basic necessities like food and healthcare. We're talking about families fleeing persecution only to end up in conditions that are just as dangerous, if not worse. How does that align with the values we claim to uphold?
You're right, Jin. The humanitarian impact can't be ignored. But if we're looking at solutions, the alternative isn't simple. Expanding court resources, hiring more judges, and building better facilities take time and money. In the short term, policies like this are meant to manage what's already an unsustainable situation. If anything, this policy highlights the need for broader reform.
Let's talk about the border emergency next. Declaring a national emergency to reallocate federal funds for wall construction. Sound familiar? This was one of Trump's most controversial moves in his first term, and now it's back. But the real question is this actually an emergency, or is it a political strategy?
Well, Jin, it depends on how you define emergency. Border crossings have surged in recent years, and you could argue that the system isn't equipped to handle it. From that standpoint, calling it an emergency justifies reallocating resources where they're most needed. That said, I'll admit, the optics of this, redirecting funds without congressional approval, are definitely going to spark legal challenges, just like last time.
Exactly, Bill. And beyond the legal issues, there's the effectiveness of the wall itself. Studies have shown that most undocumented immigrants don't cross the border illegally. They overstay their visas. So, while the wall might make a good soundbite, it's not addressing the root of the problem. It feels more like a symbol than a solution.
I'd argue it's both, Jin. Sure, it's symbolic, but symbols matter. They send a message about enforcement and deterrence. And while the wall isn't a catch-all solution, it's part of a larger strategy to control who and what comes across the border. That said, I'll agree with you on one thing. It can't be the only tool in the toolbox.
And then there's the designation of Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations, a move with big diplomatic implications. While it sounds tough, it risks straining U.S.-Mexico relations at a time when cooperation is crucial. Policies like this need to consider the long-term impact, not just the short-term political gains.
But Jin, isn't a tough stance exactly what's needed here? Mexican cartels are a massive source of violence and drug trafficking, much of which spills over into the U.S. This designation sends a clear signal that the U.S. is serious about cracking down on these networks.
Sure, but what happens when that signal backfires? If this move alienates Mexico's government, We lose a key partner in combating the cartels. Cooperation, not confrontation, is how you deal with a cross-border issue like this.
Look, immigration is a complex issue, and no single policy is going to fix it. But these executive orders at least put the spotlight back on areas that need reform. The real question is whether Congress will finally step up to do its part.
And that's the problem, Bill. We're stuck in this cycle of executive orders and legal battles because Congress refuses to act. In the meantime, families are suffering, and these policies are doing more harm than good. Coming up next, we'll shift gears to another big-ticket issue, climate policy. Stick around. Let's talk climate policy. With Trump's executive orders rolling back environmental regulations and withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords, it feels like we're watching a replay of his first term. But this time, the stakes are even higher. The world is grappling with extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and mounting pressure to transition to renewable energy. So, how do these policies hold up in the face of those challenges?
Well, Jin, let's not forget that climate policy isn't just about the environment. It's also about economics. Trump's team is betting that deregulation and energy independence will boost the economy by cutting costs for businesses and creating jobs in fossil fuel industries. Now, whether that's sustainable in the long run is another question, but it's hard to ignore the short-term benefits.
Sure, Bill, short-term benefits might look good on paper, but the long-term costs are astronomical. Just think about the wildfires in California, the hurricanes along the Gulf Coast, or the droughts impacting farmers across the country. Those disasters come with billion-dollar price tags, not to mention the human toll. By rolling back environmental protections, we're essentially writing a blank check to climate change.
You're right, Jin. The costs of climate disasters are undeniable. But let's look at the Paris Climate Accords for a moment. Critics have pointed out that even with widespread participation, global emissions have continued to rise. So, the question is, does rejoining the Accords actually solve the problem, or does it just create the illusion of progress?
The Paris Climate Accords aren't perfect, Bill, but they've set a framework for accountability and international cooperation. Many countries, including the U.S. during the Biden administration, used the Accords as a springboard to invest in renewable energy and reduce emissions. The issue isn't the framework itself. It's the lack of enforcement mechanisms and inconsistent commitment from major players, including us.
And that's exactly the point, Jin. Without enforceable rules, the Accords are only as strong as the political will behind them. Countries like China and India, two of the biggest emitters, have struggled to meet their targets. Meanwhile, the U.S. rejoining and then leaving again creates instability. Maybe the focus should be on bilateral agreements or market-driven solutions that incentivize innovation.
Market-driven solutions are important, but they're not enough on their own. We need federal investment to scale renewable energy infrastructure. Rolling back EV tax credits and expanding fossil fuel drilling sends the wrong message when we should be doubling down on clean energy. If anything, the renewable energy sector is where the future jobs are, not coal mines or oil rigs.
I agree that renewables are the future, Jin, but energy independence matters too. Fossil fuels still account for a majority of global energy consumption, and transitioning takes time. Policies like fast-tracking oil and gas permits ensure that we're not over-reliant on foreign energy sources during that transition. The key is balancing long-term goals with immediate needs.
But that balance can't come at the expense of climate action, Bill. The science is clear. We need to act now to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Every year we delay is another year of rising emissions and escalating crises. Trump's policies might provide short-term relief for fossil fuel industries, but at what cost to future generations?
It's a tough trade-off, Jin. On one hand, you have the pressing needs of the present, jobs, energy costs, economic recovery. On the other, the existential threat of climate change. The reality is, we need solutions that address both, and that means acknowledging the limitations of sweeping agreements like the Paris Accords while finding new ways to lead globally.
Bill, I have to say, this isn't just a policy debate for me. It feels deeply personal. When I think about what these decisions mean for kids growing up now, for families displaced by climate disasters, and for communities fighting to rebuild after hurricanes or wildfires, it's overwhelming. These aren't abstract concepts. They're people's lives, their futures. And to watch us roll back protections, knowing we have the tools and the science to make a difference, it's heartbreaking. We're choosing short-term gains over long-term survival, and that's not just frustrating, it's devastating. We have to be better than this. And, Bill, it's hard to be optimistic when it feels like we're stepping backward on such a critical issue. I can only hope that we realize the urgency before it's too late. So, next, we'll shift gears to government accountability and Trump's Schedule F executive order. What does it mean for federal workers and the balance of power? Stay with us.
Let's turn to a topic that's flown under the radar for many but could reshape how the federal government operates: Trump's revival of Schedule F. This executive order reclassifies certain federal employees, making them at-will positions. In plain terms, it means they can be hired or fired based on loyalty rather than traditional merit-based systems. On the surface, it's about efficiency, but beneath it lies a heated debate about politicization, accountability, and the future of government neutrality.
Absolutely, Bill. The federal workforce is supposed to operate independently of political pressures, ensuring that government functions remain stable and impartial. By introducing Schedule F, the administration is essentially saying, if you're not with us, you're against us. That's a dangerous precedent to set for democracy. It risks turning civil service into a partisan battleground, where expertise takes a backseat to loyalty.
I get your point, Jin, and I'll admit that there's a fine line here. But let's not ignore the inefficiencies in the current system. Critics of federal bureaucracy argue that entrenched civil servants can stall or resist policies from incoming administrations, effectively acting as gatekeepers. Schedule F might seem extreme, but it's aimed at removing those roadblocks and aligning the workforce with the administration's goals.
But Bill, isn't that exactly the problem? The federal government isn't supposed to be an arm of any administration. It's supposed to serve the people, regardless of who's in power. By reclassifying these positions, you're creating a revolving door where every new administration wipes the slate clean. That's not just destabilizing, it undermines the very foundation of good governance.
I hear you, Jin, but Trump's team would argue that loyalty and alignment are necessary to implement policies effectively. They see entrenched resistance as an obstacle to fulfilling campaign promises and delivering results. And look, it's not like Schedule F applies to all federal employees. Only those in policymaking or senior roles where alignment with the administration is arguably more important.
But where does it stop, Bill? Once you open the door to politicizing one sector of the workforce, it's a slippery slope. What's to stop future administrations from expanding these classifications further? And let's not forget the chilling effect this has. Who's going to blow the whistle on corruption or unethical practices if they know their job depends on political loyalty?
That's a fair concern, Jin, and it's one reason Schedule F faces significant legal hurdles. Civil service protections, like those established under the Pendleton Act, are designed to prevent exactly this kind of politicization. Lawsuits challenging Schedule F will likely argue that it violates those protections. And there's also the question of separation of powers. Can the executive branch unilaterally redefine the federal workforce?
Exactly. And if courts uphold Schedule F, it sets a precedent that future administrations could exploit. It's not just about Trump. It's about what this means for the long-term health of our institutions. Do we want a government that serves the public interest, or one that bends to the whims of whoever's in power?
I don't think it's an either-or, Jin. The challenge is finding a balance between efficiency and neutrality. The federal government does need reform in some areas, but we can't afford to lose the trust and expertise that come from an independent civil service. Schedule F might have noble intentions in theory, but its practical implications could be far-reaching and unpredictable.
Far-reaching and dangerous, Bill. Our government isn't perfect, but it works because it's built on principles of accountability and fairness. Tinkering with that balance risks undermining decades of progress. The real question is, are we reforming to strengthen democracy, or are we reforming to consolidate power? If it's the latter, then we've lost sight of what governance should be about.
Fair point, Jin. And it's a question we'll likely hear more about as legal challenges unfold. Next, we'll take a step back and examine the broader implications of Trump's second term so far. What themes are emerging, and what's the bigger picture? Stick around.
As we wrap up today's discussion, let's take a step back and reflect on everything we've covered. We started with Trump's executive order on tariffs, a move aimed at protecting American industries, but one that sparked significant pushback from key allies and industries. Then, we delved into the legal challenges surrounding birthright citizenship, a policy that raises profound constitutional and humanitarian questions. From there, we explored immigration policies like Remain in Mexico and the border emergency, which are reshaping how the U.S. handles migration. We also examined climate policies, including the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords and the rollback of environmental protections, and finally, we looked at Schedule F and its potential to disrupt the foundations of government neutrality.
It's a lot to unpack, Jin, but one thing is clear. Trump's second term is shaping up to be just as transformative and divisive as his first. These policies aren't just statements. They're fundamentally rethinking how power is exercised and what it means to govern in America.
What's really striking to me, Bill, is how these policies reflect a shift in priorities. It feels like we're prioritizing power and expediency over principles and people. Policies like these don't just affect numbers on a spreadsheet, they ripple through communities, families, and lives. If we keep moving in this direction, I worry about what's left of the trust we have in our government and in each other.
That's a fair concern, Jin. But I'd argue that these debates are also exposing inefficiencies and weaknesses in our systems, things that have been ignored for far too long. If nothing else, this administration is forcing us to confront those gaps, even if the proposed solutions are controversial or imperfect. The real test will be whether we can channel this moment into meaningful, bipartisan reforms, or if we just keep playing political tug-of-war.
And that's where leadership comes in, Bill. True leadership isn't just about making bold moves. It's about thinking through the ripple effects. It's about asking, who does this help? Who does this hurt? What does this mean for the next generation? We need leaders who care about more than just their term in office. We need leaders who care about building something that lasts.
I completely agree, Jen. Leadership without accountability is dangerous, and that's why these debates are so important. Whether you support these policies or not, it's clear that the stakes are higher than ever. It's not just about who's in power. It's about the kind of government we want for the future.
And that's where you come in. These issues don't happen in a vacuum. They affect all of us. If you have thoughts, questions, or personal stories about how these policies are impacting you, we want to hear from you. Join the conversation on social media or send us a message.
At the end of the day, democracy is only as strong as the people who participate in it. Whether you're supporting these policies or challenging them, staying informed and engaged is the first step to making a difference.
Thanks for tuning in to Politics Explained,
where we deliver unbiased, unfiltered, and understandable analyses of the issues that matter most.
We'll see you next time.